Hello, I'm Greg Castor, Hanson Peterson Chair of Liberal Studies at Gustavus Adolphus College and a member of the History Department. Last spring, my colleagues Laura Burke of Biology and Madalena Marinari of History collaborated on an innovative interdisciplinary course on eugenics and eugenic testing. I had the privilege of sitting in on that course, and afterwards I invited them to speak about their collaboration. And here's what they had to say. Okay, well, the first question is, how did you come to do this collaboration? What led to it?
So we started talking a lot about our own individual research areas and sort of our interest in teaching over the last couple of years. So we started at the very same time. We met in first year faculty orientation, and then over the last couple of years we sort of realized that we had this common interest in sort of the application in the human side of science. And so that started maybe to come together a little more through our work on the Nobel 2017 conference. So that conference was about reproductive technology. And then based off of that, and based off of conversations with the conference chair, Yuri Hong, we really started to become interested in collaborating together.
And we also, while we were working on the Nobel conference, we also decided to apply for a national grant so that we could perhaps come up with a model that then the college could use for its general education curriculum. And so we spent an entire summer. We became really close because we drafted this thing several times. But the more we worked on it, the more excited we got about the possibility of actually working together and bridging science and the humanities. And I think one of the things that got us really excited was that we could both learn from each other. I mean, I think that's one of the things that was really cool about the class. Half of the time I was a student, the other half I was the professor. So it's good to be reminded too, right? What it means to learn from the other side.
So how did you work in some concrete ways, talk about that if you would, the interdisciplinary part of the course, which really is what it was. That's, I think, for me, the most exciting part about it.
So we spent an entire semester working on a class schedule. So first we decided what are our goals in this class, what are the things that we want to accomplish. And some of the goals were we want them to learn about the research methods in the humanities and in the sciences. We want them to learn what evidence and data, yes, the language is different, is for each discipline, and also how you go about thinking and asking questions in a different way in the two disciplines. So once we decided what it is that we wanted to do, we spent a long time on the schedule because we really wanted to balance each side without sacrificing not just content, but the heart of each discipline. And since each of us only had half of the semester, that was quite the challenge. So we actually had to give up, our obsession with we have to do all of this and say, so we preferred depth, I think, over breadth.
Yeah, and I think that emphasis on depth really helped think about how to coordinate the disciplines. And so from a practical side, what we did in the class is we had sort of science Mondays and history Wednesdays, and then on Fridays we really tried to bring it together. And so we thought about, well, what is the science background the students really need to be able to think about this really deeply, and what is the history background that the students really need to be able to think about this deeply. And then on Fridays we had discussion days, and we talked about things like the genetics of race. What are the problems with that? We talked about the history of genetics and how that linked up with the development of eugenics, and really like what was going on in both disciplines at the same time, how are they informing each other there, and then looking maybe at a more modern case of how are they informing each other now.
And I think we also were interested in showing where they diverged, right? Because I think right now it's safe to say that popular beliefs about these issues are very different than what scientists are much more skeptical, but that skepticism hasn't translated into mainstream America essentially.
Was there a main assignment or project for the course? And if so, what was it, and how do you think it worked?
So there are actually two major assignments for the course. One of them was a research project in genetics, and then the other one was a research project in history. And so the students actually developed their own question and did their own independent lab research in the sciences. And so it was on topics of looking at how we use yeast cells, and essentially we looked at how those yeast cells could be a model for humans, thinking about how those genetic changes in those yeast really influenced their responses to drugs and other sorts of environmental stresses. And so it's really based on sort of the fundamentals of what is a gene and how does that link to a phenotype that you see. But at the same time, they really were novel questions. And so the students weren't just repeating something that had been done before, but were really digging into it. And then they also had a history research project that Madeleine will tell you a little bit about.
Yeah, so for history, essentially they had to look at one way that eugenics affected reproduction. And so they had case studies that they had to dig deeper into, right? So they had to find primary sources from the time, like newspaper articles, scientific texts. It was really interesting to see science majors to read some of this scientific knowledge differently now that they had the historical background behind them. Like how people were deemed as affected with disability, why women were the primary target of sterilization campaigns, the history of the pill and how complicated it was because it was an incentive for working class women not to have children, which is not something I think they expected. The one thing that I thought was interesting is we intentionally created groups with students from mixed disciplines, and I think that ended up being perhaps one of the best thing we did, because in very practical ways they could see, for example, why the humanities students were struggling in the lab and why science students were surprised by some of the questions that humanities students were asking during the history research project. And I think it was a really good way for them to come together from different perspectives and try to have conversation about how you bridge these different disciplines. And I think it worked.
I think so too. And I was really impressed by how the students thought about how research was similar and different in the different disciplines. Because at the beginning of the semester, we actually had a panel discussion between a couple scientists and a couple more humanities focused researchers. And we sort of collected students' preconceptions about what research would be like in these different disciplines. And then after they'd done research in both of these disciplines, we asked them those same questions again, and it was amazing to see how much they realized how similar in many ways research is in all the different disciplines.
The other interesting thing is that they started the semester thinking, oh, science research is definitely much harder than history research. By the end of the semester, I think some of the scientists really appreciated how complex it was. Like, no, I think science research is easier because at least you can go back and do an experiment. But with history, you might never get an answer, and you kind of have to be comfortable with not knowing the whole story. Right? So I think in the end, they decided that they were equally challenging, just in different ways.
What was most challenging for you as the instructors in putting the course together and teaching it? What was really tricky or difficult?
I think the most challenging part was that initial, like, what are we going to put in the class? Because we both had so many different ideas, and we both had our own knowledge of, some history classes I'd taken previously as an undergraduate myself, or what Madeleine had read in the news about science, but we both didn't have that sort of deep knowledge, and so it really took us a while to sort of grapple with what are the most important things in genetics to cover, what are the most important things in history to cover, and how do we really integrate them. And so once we had the schedule, I think it was actually maybe in some ways an easier class to teach than some of the other classes I've taught. But that schedule was much harder to put together than I anticipated.
Yeah, I think we really had, I don't even know, pages and pages of ideas of things that we could do. And then we decided, okay, let's focus on reproduction and build everything around that from a historical perspective and a scientific perspective. because, with eugenics, you can take it in a million different directions. And I was saying, oh, we could do, living patterns and education. But it's like, no, let's go back and focus just on reproduction. And I think focusing in, I think, really helped us. The other challenge, I would say, which I think in the end paid off, was encouraging the students in believing in themselves that they could do this, right? Because we were asking them to work on 2 research projects. So from our perspective, we had to really scaffold everything, right? And we had to design the course around these 2 projects. So we did a lot of work in class or in the lab, knowing that half of the class might not be comfortable with what we were asking them to do. And I think that was an important decision too, right? But at times, I think we both felt as cheerleaders. It's like, you guys can do this. And I mean, in the end, it paid off. We still hear from the students. They still send us articles. They still say that class just blew us away. So it worked, but I think it required a lot of thinking and planning, especially in terms of the assignments and cheering, right?
And would that be your advice for people, Gustavus faculty contemplating team teaching, to give a lot of thought to the schedule and the sort of outline of the course? That sounds like it was the most challenging part of it.
I think that most of the work is actually before the class begins.
Yeah, so give yourself that mental time and space to really sort of talk and think about what are the important things in our disciplines and how do they really fit together. And then I think the other thing is from a really practical side.
I was going to say the same.
Actually, we divided up, okay, I'm going to be the primary person that's responsible for grading these elements of the class. I'm going to be the primary person responsible for these elements. And that really just kind of freed us as the semester went to think about, oh, well, we just learned this amazing thing. How can we integrate that into the class? And didn't really have to worry about any of the practical things once the semester started. And so I think that was really helpful.
Yeah, and I think the students could see that we had talked about it a lot, that we agreed on the approach that we had chosen, that we were committed to it. At the same time, I think another strength was that we were both flexible. Like a couple of times we had to extend the deadline, because I mean this was a challenge for us, and we recognized that it could be challenging for students too, and so we were open, because I think it's really, really important to realize that the first time around is never easy to teach a class. The first time teaching a team taught class might have additional challenges, but I think talking in advance. And when I say talking, it's not just about what we're going to do, really about policies. Like we had to discuss late work policies, who's grading what, who is responsible for being the contact person about what. And I think having that clarity helped us first, but it really gave more confidence to students too, which in the end was our goal.
What did you find most gratifying about the experience?
I think the 2 things that I found most gratifying were seeing the students make those connections. So really that the diversity of the students was amazing in the class. We had everything from first years to seniors and biology majors to political science majors to potential psychology majors, and seeing them make the connections between the different disciplines and seeing them interact with each other all the time was amazing. And then another thing that I found really gratifying was just purely the amount of information that I learned.
Yeah, I think I was going to say the same thing. Being a student was really refreshing, because I think, I mean, I haven't sat in a classroom as a student in a really long time, and it was good for me to understand, okay, what are the challenges? I mean, Laura was amazing when I was like, oh, I need to read this more closely, otherwise I won't be able to follow her. So that opportunity of being on both sides was actually really exciting. And also, like Laura, I really appreciated that the students were making connections, but to me it was also striking how they were making connections with other classes. They were making connections with what was happening in the real world, and so, which is the ultimate goal of liberal arts education, right? And it's like, wow, this is possible. They're doing it, and the fact that I think we keep hearing from them shows that these type of classes actually push their boundaries, right? I mean, it's might be uncomfortable as it unfolds, but it really helps them bridge the different kind of knowledge that they're being exposed to, the different kinds of knowledge.
Will you do it again?
I'd love to do it again,
Yes.
absolutely. So I think that it's really shifted my teaching too, in that I really can see how what we did in that class is influencing what I'm doing in my cancer biology class, what I'm doing in my first term seminar class this year, what I'm planning to do in my microbiology class going forward. And so I think that both the sort of approach to teaching, that I learned a lot from being in the classroom with Madalena, but also thinking about some of these bigger social issues and thinking about how to integrate social issues into my science teaching. I think all of that has been really affected by the class, and I'd love to have another chance to continue to build on that and continue to think deeply about it. And also, I just love history documents, and so the chance to see more would be fun.
Yeah. No, I definitely want to do it again. It was, I think, by far the most impactful teaching experience I've had since I've been doing this, and not just because the topics are so relevant, like eugenics and genetic testing, and so I think we owe it to ourselves and our students to kind of look at these issues more deeply and more closely. But it's because learning more about science has shifted how I do history too, and I think it's also useful for students in the humanities to see we can actually do this, right? Maybe it's the right topic. It's definitely, with the right professor, but we should continue challenging ourselves. I mean, we always say that we try to be lifelong learners. This is the perfect opportunity to do that.
Exactly.
Even not just for the student perspective, but for us.
I learned so much.
Yeah, no, me as well.